Now, I'm very glad to be able to welcome to the Holocaust series Professor Diane Parness, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Sonoma State University. She received her Ph.D. from Georgetown University and is a specialist in comparative politics with particular emphasis on European politics. The topic of her dissertation was the SPD, that is the Social Democratic Party in West Germany, and the challenge of mass politics, the dilemma of the Volkspartei, or the dilemma of the People's Party. The SPD already existed before National Socialism and then continued to exist in West Germany and is now in the United Germany. Parness recently received a grant to study the rise of the right and especially the Republikaner Party in Germany, and she will be traveling to Germany this summer to interview representatives from the major parties concerning this troubling phenomenon in European politics. She has recently presented a series of studies of the far right at professional conferences throughout the United States, and she hopes by next year to have a book out about the far right in Germany, which we are all very much concerned about, and I'm sure the book will shed a lot of light on this. Today, Dr. Parness will talk exclusively about the Weimar Republic, the period between 1918 and 1933 in Germany. That is the period before National Socialism. And the topic of her lecture is From Versailles to Dachau, the political and economic context for National Socialism. Let's welcome Professor Parness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilke. Well, the essential task before us today is to ask a question that has burdened political scientists, historians, and anybody interested in the phenomenon of fascism for the past 50 years, and that is how a civilized nation such as Germany could embrace such a hideous phenomenon. And tragically and chillingly, because it would appear that so many conditions are being replicated today, the burden for that embrace must be placed with what happened to the Weimar Republic, a noble experiment in democratic government that failed horribly and tragically. The old chestnut about Weimar that you will inevitably hear in any lecture or study of the topic is that it was a democracy without democrats. It was a republic, but without republicans, and that is most true. It was the effort to impose a democratic structure of government with one of the prettiest little democratic constitutions ever designed by man on an essentially authoritarian political culture. We see the same experiment being played out in many of the nations of Eastern Europe today, and we watch with growing trepidation to see if the of Weimar might not be again repeated. So again, the story of Weimar is the story of 1994 and bears very careful study for anyone interested in the transition to democracy that is being effected in Eastern Europe. Surely the rise and fall of the Weimar Republic is one of the most tragic and melancholy political tales of modern times. Defeated in World War I, the German people were presented with another opportunity to rid themselves of their reactionary past and to join the mainstream of Western democratic governments. Once again, as in 1848, they had an opportunity to break new ground. But the shocking and lamentable denouement of the Weimar Republic led straight to the shame of National Socialism. How did it happen? The tragedy of Weimar stems, once again, from a very misguided attempt to impose, as we said before, a pristine democratic constitution and political structure on an overwhelmingly authoritarian political culture and on a people who had absolutely no use or no interest in the responsibilities or the values of democratic government. The German people were neither receptive to nor prepared for the responsibilities, the uncertainties, and the sacrifices of democratic government. And clearly, from the very outset, the elites of the old regime, of the old order, who were still firmly entrenched in their positions of power throughout Germany, the government, but in positions of power outside of government, were dead set against this experiment in democracy from the first day of the Weimar Republic. Add to this the incapacity of Weimar's political parties, even those who supported the Republic, even those who created the Republic, to overcome their differences, to establish a coherent program of desperately needed legislation to relieve Germany of its economic disaster. Add to this agitation not just from the right, that came later, not just from this new fascist movement, but firstly from the left, with the call for Bolshevism in Germany. And you see that democracy was trapped in a cauldron of seething political turbulence, again, from day one. Add to this the very sad fact, that Weimar was sabotaged by friends and foes alike, both within and outside of Germany. Those who had the most to gain from the firm establishment of democracy in Germany after World War I did a great deal to sabotage that experiment in democracy themselves. At home, the men who sought to make it work, primarily the Social Democrats, the so-called Republicans and their alliance with the Democrats and the Liberal Party and the Center Party, were too hesitant, were too politically timid, and were too reluctant to cast off the traditions of old political order. This would pose too much of a threat, too much of a challenge to the old elites, to the old established interests, and that was simply too frightening, even for those who wanted democracy to work in Germany. They were honest, they were well-meaning, and they made one critical political, to say nothing of economic, mistake after another. They themselves, largely owing to the political order of the old regime, many of them were members of the old Reichstag, were members of the old legislature, but because of the nature of government in authoritarian Germany, they may have been in the legislature, but they had no experience in handling genuine political power. And they didn't know how to contend with those problems when political power was thrust upon them. And so they looked to the obvious solution. They looked to share power with the elites of the old order, the professionals, the men who were born, who were bred, who were educated to govern, the men who knew how to run Germany. And these, of course, were the cardinal foes of the democratic order, particularly the Prussian military elites, the Junkers, and the industrial elites, those who had the most to lose from democracy, those to whom democracy posed the greatest challenge to power. These men, the true power brokers in the old and the new Germany, harbored nothing but contempt for the idea of democracy, for the idea of a republican government. They believed that it was doomed to disorder, doomed to corruption. They had nothing but contempt for its values. They harbored nothing but contempt for its very way of life. To them, this was a shattering of the noble traditions of the Hohenzollernreich, and it was to be disbanded, thrown aside as quickly as possible. As a result, this coalition between the pro-Republican forces of the new government and the old elites was a coalition that was destined for ruin. So the Republic was besieged from two sides. It was besieged by wild nationalists on the right and by equally fanatical internationalists on the left, screaming for a proletarian revolution of global proportions. This was the moment, and this was the place. After all, this is 1918. God, Bolshevism had just conquered Russia. And Russia was certainly not the place Marx had in mind when he spoke of a new proletarian world order. Germany was the model. And now, as we said, the conditions were ripe. The moment was at hand. Why settle? Why compromise for some bourgeois trapping of democratic order when we can attain a genuine socialist republic, call of the far left? Well, this assault from the lunatic fringe, as Teddy Roosevelt would have called them, is nothing new in the annals of democratic government. The French are certainly painfully familiar with the phenomenon. But Weimar was also in the peculiar condition of being assaulted from the middle. The men who championed the Republic, the Democrats, steered a blundering, tortuous course that failed to satisfy anyone. They themselves weren't satisfied by the compromises they had to continually make to try and establish, again, coherent political and economic policy in the new republic. And beyond all of this, and a very painful fact for us in the West to remember, was that those who wished to set democracy on its feet in Germany were long abandoned by the victors of World War I. Again, the Allies, who had much to gain from a sturdy democracy being set in Central Europe. Had as much to gain from German democracy as the Germans themselves, at least, but seemed to do everything in their power to sabotage that democracy, also from the very. The Allies were absolutely determined that Germany not forget its responsibility for the horrendous, the admittedly horrendous suffering of World War I. And this determination was surely exemplified by the terribly punitive provisions of the Versailles Peace Treaty. But at least as damaging in the minds of the German people as economic and political provisions of the Versailles Treaty was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, that held Germany and her allies exclusively responsible for causing the war. Well, in effect, Article 231 played directly into the hands of the German militarists, the Prussian warlords, instructing their anger for defeat in World War I against the military. The German public turned against the foreigners who were placing the onus of guilt for the war exclusively on the German people. Patriotic Germans, once they were advised of Article 231, and regardless of their class, regardless of their party, regarded this as a slur on the honor of the German people. And almost immediately after Versailles was signed, a campaign would mount against the so-called Kriegsschuldlüge, the war guilt lie. And again, it would be the vehicle of a very effective propaganda machine that would grow in momentum in the years of the Weimar Republic. Now, the government of Weimar suffered more than anyone else from this controversy because, after all, it was its representatives who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, who had cast aside German honor. And again, it was they who were largely held responsible by the German people for having defamed the nation in this sort of manner. Added to this outrage was a growing conviction that the German army had not actually lost the war. Disastrous their army's defeat had been on the battlefield. Now, for generations prior to World War I, they had been told in no uncertain terms that their armies were unconquerable, that their supreme command, their military caste, was composed of supermen who would lead their armies to victory regardless of what circumstances may befall them. regardless of the odds, with the supreme command of the German army. He regarded them as a bunch of traitors. He didn't want anything to do with those militarists, those warlords. Well, this again may have been an error, because he would not permit them to come and sign the Versailles Treaty. And so the heads of the Weimar Republic, the Democrats, as I said before, went and signed this slur on Germany. And again, they paid the price in the minds of the German people. So the supreme command of the German army essentially avoided the act of surrender. And the representatives of Weimar signed the dotted line. Again, a severe political blunder. Almost immediately, German militarists, amply supported by publicists throughout, right-wing publicists, throughout socialists, communists, and of course especially Jews, had so weakened the domestic front that the military could not function on the battlefield. The cowards at home who had destroyed the fabric of the German nation were responsible for the army's disgrace. Well, propagandists all over Germany jumped on this bandwagon. Hitler advanced it, of course, in Mein Kampf, and the public, again, was immeasurably weakened by the growing power of this myth, a power that would escalate throughout the years of Weimar. The leaders of the new republic were never secure enough to touch the power of the old army elites. The Weimar Republic never established its own republican army, and so it always had to seek the defense, support of what should have been one of its primary foes, an institution, a state within a state, as it would become in years to follow, an institution committed to dissolving the Weimar Republic and reestablishing the monarchy and the old traditions of the German Reich. Reeling from the confusion, from the frustration of defeat, Germany was also beset by a virtual eruption of social and political chaos at home. While it's going through this process of signing the Treaty of Versailles, the new government is trying to ward off the threat of a socialist insurrection. A socialist revolution exploded in Bavaria, of all the unlikely places, on November 7th, 1918, just 4 days before the armistice had been signed. The Bavarian king, Ludwig III, was forced to flee, and a republic is proclaimed in Bavaria. Once Ludwig and the monarchy, the Bavarian monarchy, the Wittgensteins, the Wittelsbachs, were forced to abdicate, the German princes lined up like dominoes and fell in a row. That's another major factor affecting German unity at this time. Facade. Germany had been a nation, ostensibly since 1871, but in truth it was still composed of very independent principalities, and people who looked on themselves more as Bavarians, as Prussians, as Hessens than they ever did as Germans. The unity of the German nation was very fragile indeed. Well, with the collapse of the Bavarian monarchy, in effect, all of the German princes gave up their thrones, and the monarchy itself was on the brink of collapse. This had a very compelling psychological effect on the German people, because this was their link with the past. This was their tradition. These were their monarchs. Shortly thereafter, Wilhelm II, the last of the Hohenzollerns, was forced to flee Germany. He sought asylum in the Netherlands, where he remained for the next 23 years, apparently spending most of his time chopping wood, but be that as it may, the German imperial regime had effectively collapsed, and with it, the semblance of tradition and order in Germany. Smack in the midst of this incredible turbulence, the new republic proclaimed. The dominant party affecting the formation of the Weimar Republic is the SPD, the then Socialist Party of Germany, and the dominant figure in that party, Friedrich Ebert. But even this party in itself is painfully divided, very painfully divided. The majority faction in the SPD, the so-called majority socialists. The left of the party, the so-called independent socialists, guided by such luminary, I guess we should say, figures as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And these are the people who, of course, are calling for the creation of a Soviet in Germany, calling for the creation of a genuine, full-scale Bolshevik revolution. They would refuse to serve in the government of the Republic. Again, they regarded Weimar as a bourgeois democratic sham. They regarded participation in the government as a betrayal of the values of socialism. This was the moment, this was the opportunity they had long awaited, and revolution would be had at any cost. While this is going on throughout Germany, Germany is on the brink of a veritable civil war. Don't underestimate the extent of this strife, of this campaign on the part of the left. Millions of demobilized German soldiers are returning from the front. Some of them are returning to jobs, but many of them are returning to nothing. Once released from the army, and of course Germany is forced, as we'll see in a moment, by virtue of the Versailles Treaty, to drastically downscale the size of its army, are left to wander, looking essentially for some way to make a living, looking for something to do. These men, these former members of the Reichswehr, would become logical recruits for a new organization, a new volunteer army of the right, the so-called Freikorps. And it would be their primary purpose to smash the threat of socialism in Germany. And they would provide the core of the opposition to the left, and they would take part in some of the bloodiest urban campaigns in Germany during this very tumultuous period. Well into 1919, organized forces of the right would battle the more disparate forces of the left until finally, at least the immediate threat of Bolshevism in Germany quelled. The ironic effect of the dissolution of the left, of the quelling of the communist insurrection in Germany, would be that the left throughout the Weimar Republic would be irrevocably divided. The left would never again function as a cohesive unit. The socialists would have to battle the independent socialists, would have to battle the communists. And they were as opposed to one another as they were to the right. And as a result, the faction, if you will, or the organized left that might have posed a serious threat to the advance of Hitler in the latter days of 1932, refused to work together. And so the path was cleared for any effective opposition to the advance of the right. The animosity between the parties was simply too deep. And so no semblance of political order would be established on the left in Germany throughout the years of the Weimar Republic. Well, in the latter part of 1919, some semblance of political order is established in the Republic. The Germans went to the polls in the first month of that year. They elected the first constituent assembly of the Weimar Republic. It was a very moderate assembly, at least in appearance. The largest party was the majority socialist, the SPD. Certainly nothing approaching an absolute majority, but healthy representation nonetheless. And they were able to forge a coalition with the other pro-Republican parties, the Democrats and the Center Party. So the forces of the Republic, it would seem at the time, had the bulk of support of the German people. And the center of gravity of this first democratic legislature was just slightly left of center, but still quite typical, quite moderate in its coloration. But almost immediately, the first item on the agenda, the first task of the new government, is the signing of the Versailles Peace Treaty. When they went to the negotiating table, when the conference was held to determine the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, the German delegation was under the impression that both sides were going to abide by Wilson's 14 points, which was regarded as a just basis for peace, an acceptable basis for ending the hostilities and of going on with the business of establishing an international community, of getting the League of Nations, for example, off to a good start. But once at the Versailles Peace Conference, the German delegation was faced, again, with some of the most punitive provisions determined by any peace treaty in modern times, and they were hardly in a position to negotiate. As a result of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany lost 1/8 of its land. It lost approximately 6.5 million people. It had to sacrifice all of its colonies and, in effect, all of its investments abroad, which, of course, had a disastrous effect on the German economy. There was also Allied occupation of the Rhineland. Its army, as we suggested a moment ago, was only 100,000 men. Munitions were also severely curtailed, and the Navy was similarly limited in size. Once they were aware of the actual provisions of the Versailles Treaty, the German people exploded in wrath, in rage against the treaty. The government itself, the pro-Republican government, determined that the treaty was unfillable, unbearable, and ruinous. But again, the straw that really broke the camel's back was the war guilt clause. That upset more people probably than any other provision of the Treaty of Versailles. But the Allies were absolutely adamant. They were resolute and they were unflinching that Germany alone should bear responsibility for the pain inflicted by the First World War. Indeed, it should be severely, severely punished. Well, again, the Germans were, after all, had lost, and they were in no position to protest. The treaty was signed on June 28th of 1919. And that same day, the Deutsche Zeitung, a national German newspaper, appeared with a mourning band on its front page, announcing simply that today German honor is dragged to grave, and calling for vengeance for the shame of 1919. There's very little doubt that the Treaty of Versailles may have dealt a fatal blow to the Weimar Republic. In their rush to weaken Germany, an understandable consensus, the Allies had simply overlooked the fact that the Weimar coalition, which was their natural ally and in democracy, was being placed in an intolerable and untenable position. In effect, it would never be able to establish democratic government. Instead of making Germany safe for democracy, the Allies had burdened the fledgling republic with the onus of war guilt. In effect, the Versailles Peace Treaty strengthened the reactionaries in Germany by giving them a weapon of inestimable value. The next task before this new and already beleaguered government was to draft a new constitution. In so doing, and led by Dr. Hugo Preuss, a document was constructed that attempted to embrace the very essence of democratic government. But again, the primary problem was what was written in the Constitution was not the provisions of the Constitution. It was that the democratic structure that the Constitution provided for was being imposed upon what one author described as an industrialized feudal society, which was a very apt way of describing the way German society functioned in those days after the First World War. Very strong affinity for the ways of the monarchy, the ways of the Old Reich. Again, the Weimar Constitution was a virtually letter-perfect document, and it embodied the best features of the British Bill of Rights, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and of the first 10 amendments of the American Constitution. Well, what more could you ask for? How could you include anything else that would make a document more democratic, establish a better basis for the beginnings of a democratic society? Although the form of the government was a republic, it was designated once again as the German Reich, not the German Republic. And in so doing, the Assembly wanted to appease the members of the old order. They wanted the new regime to be regarded as a continuation of Germany's politician, a continuation of the old, not a clean break. They wanted to bring what they had been proud of into the new order as well. In effect, there was no sharp break with the past. Now, among the elaborate democratic features of the new Constitution and the new system of government, the drafters of the Weimar Constitution decided to employ an electoral law known as proportional representation in the new republic. Proportional representation is the most democratic of electoral options. In effect, it permits a political voice for virtually every political party that attains a reasonable percentage of the vote. Its tragic effect, of course, the fatal price of this democratic provision, it would permit radical splinter parties to gain a propaganda base in the new legislature. What would begin as rather small parties on the far right and on the far left would have a voice in the legislature, would be able to affect and bully their way into policy completely out of proportion to their actual presence in the new legislature. And this would be the beginning of a national forum, of course, for the Nazis. They would have, in other words, a base to espouse their propaganda, and a national base to espouse their propaganda. The other critical weakness of the Weimar Constitution was the infamous Article 48, the most controversial item of the new Constitution. Article 48 was, in effect, a loophole clause. It would permit the President of the Republic. Germany, of course, was what we call a bicephalous executive, a divided executive. It had a president and it had a chancellor. Article 48 would permit the President of the Republic to exercise emergency powers in economic times or in the midst of serious political chaos. It would, in effect, permit the President to virtually single-handedly abrogate all of the democratic freedoms that had been so carefully laid out in the other articles of the Weimar Constitution, and for an unspecified period of time. Article 48, in effect, provided the perfect open edge for weapons to destroy the Weimar Republic, and it would be Article 48 that would, in effect, make Adolf Hitler's road to the chancellery a legal one, and not one that was simply effective by a political bullying process. It would also make his establishment of a dictatorship legal by virtue of the stipulations of the Weimar Constitution. The men who made the Constitution were obviously operating in times of extreme political instability and extreme economic chaos. They were anxious to provide for effective control of the far left and the far right, the most serious threats to the new order. In effect, what they did with Article 48 was make it possible for the extremists to overcome the Republic. Unwittingly, they provided the enemies of the Constitution with a deadly flaw that would be used to squeeze the life out of the Weimar Republic. Article 48 is rightly referred to by historians simply as the suicide clause. Once established, after the Constitution had been accepted, after it had been ratified, the Weimar Republic was still subject to a steady stream of political assaults, to say nothing of economic turbulence. But this time, because the left effectively had been bludgeoned, the attack would come from the right, but from the established right. In 1920, there is the infamous Kapp Putsch. This was an attempt by some military aristocrats, industrial leaders, to, well, conduct a putsch, to dislodge the democratic regime. The Weimar Republic survived the Kapp Putsch, which has again been aptly described as an exercise in adult delinquency. But it was at the cost of hundreds of lives and the further concentration of power, because who had to be called in to quell this turbulence but, again, the army? The further concentration of political power in the hands of the Reichswehr, of the German army, which again by this time was becoming more and more firmly established as a power within, an independent power within the democratic order, as a state within a state. In 1923, a long series of fatal blows. It was one right after the primary in industrial bases. Without consultation with the other allies, virtually single-handedly, they elect the most efficient means of doing this. They occupy the Ruhr. Well, the Germans, unsurprisingly, reacted furiously to what they regarded as blatant French aggression. And even the British and the Americans condemned, at least public opinion condemned, the French action, which made the French all the more determined to remain precisely where they were. Unable to respond with force, because the German army, as you already know, was limited to 100,000, the Germans adopted the only policy they could. They adopted a policy of passive resistance. They called for a general strike. German workers refused to enter the factories and the mines of the Ruhr. Well, the French said, well, fine. Well, we have other ways of skinning this cat. We'll bring in our own workers, our own unemployed. The problem was French workers couldn't figure out how to run the German machinery, and the whole situation dissolved into another scene of economic collapse. The French occupation of the Ruhr was ultimately regarded as a terrible blunder, and again, a political and economic fiasco, a grotesque failure. It provoked a violent propaganda battle, French against Germans, which neither side was able to win, and still hasn't. Franco-German hatred, this is maybe hard to believe, reached its height at that point, or at least its highest level since the war years, and the wounds caused by this occupation would fester for decades to come. But again, it would dangerously sense from any perspective. But of course, most damaging was the effect of the occupation on the already suffering German economy, and the occupation triggered an economic breakdown that led to the virtual collapse of the German mark. Rampant inflation would ensue. In 1914, just before the war, the mark was valued at just couldn't keep up with, there wasn't enough paper, there weren't enough trees in the Black Forest to provide for the currency that this inflation required. Germany was in a veritable fever dance, and the stories that emerged from this economic catastrophe are extraordinary. One day a woman went to do her shopping at a butcher store, and she was caught up in a long queue going in to get the very scarce meat. She inadvertently left it get filled with German marks on the street outside of the butcher shop. She went in to get her meat. She realized what had happened. She ran back out into the street. The marks were dumped in the sewer. The basket was gone. It was more valuable than what she had carried in. Conductors would not take the fares for streetcar rides until the end of the ride, because chances were very good that in those few minutes the mark had gone up again, or had gone down again, rather. At one time, it cost 1 billion marks a letter overseas. So you get a good idea of the magnitude of the inflation of this period. No one not even the leading industrialists of Germany, was financially secure. And the effect was catastrophic, as it always is, for those with fixed incomes. The productive middle class, the backbone of the country, traditionally was deprived of its property, but it clung desperately to its white-collar status in order to avoid being thrust down into the ranks of the still despised proletariat. This was the scar that never healed, the economic collapse of the German middle classes. And these were the people who would turn to Adolf Hitler as their messiah, who would lead them out of financial ruin and chaos. It was during this inflationary fiasco that Hitler's name exploded onto the national scene for the first time when he launched his abortive and rather ill-advised beer hall putsch in Munich in November of 1923. Now, the putsch itself is uninteresting, rather pathetic, and it failed. Hitler did. But the point is that his message was announced, and he became something of a captivating figure for those who would widely admire his attitude toward the government of Weimar, towards the German Republic. The putsch also effectively called attention to a group calling itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. And again, they would attain national recognition for the first time. Unlikely as it may seem at this point, over the next 5 years, from 1924 to 1929, the Weimar Republic actually got a little breathing space. Things quieted down somewhat, largely owing to the so-called Dawes Plan. This was an effort largely on the part of the Allies, with consultation from the Italians and the Germans, to alleviate the strain of Germany's reparations schedule. They finally saw the light. They saw what was happening to destroy democracy in Germany. They realized that the answer to many of Germany's catastrophic problems were economic. And so the Dawes Plan was adopted. Well, in effect, what the Dawes Plan amounted to was the importation of tons of American funds into Germany. Germany would use the money provided by the Americans to pay reparations. Britain and France, who received most of the reparations money, were supposed to then pay their war debts to the United States, and the United States would then send more money to Germany. It was a very effective circle of international currency. It was a stopgap scheme, there's no doubt about that, but it was what was needed at the time. Actually worked quite well. The problem was that the Germans, understandably, grew accustomed to the idea that American money would flow forever. When American investors would retreat rather abruptly from the international market, the rug would be pulled out from under the plan, the rug would be pulled out from under the European economy, but that event was still to come. Over the next 5 years, the country was still beset by one political disaster after another, or at least political troubles. But economically, miraculously, the picture was changed. Bolstered by the Dawes Plan, the economy made a startling recovery. The distressing days of the inflation were virtually forgotten. People tasted prosperity for the first time in a long time. It was spectacular development, and it would be compared later with the Wirtschaftswunder, the recovery of the German the economic miracle that would come after the days of World War II. For the time being, at least, happy days were back again, however short-lived, in Germany. So for that brief 5-year period, from 24 to 29, the picture of Weimar Germany was one political trouble, always, but economic well-being. And so the immediate threat was removed. The immediate disaster was alleviated. All knew that there would be very serious trouble if the economy slowed down. the economy slowed down. The next crisis, the economic depression, 1929, would prove the death blow of the Republic. The crash of the New York Stock Exchange in October of 1929 turned the German economy into a disaster of major proportions. The Depression hit everyone, not just in this country, in Europe, with a stunning blow, but it hit the German economy with a thunderous impact. Countless social security system, its unemployment insurance system collapsed. It simply couldn't bear the strain. The money just wasn't there. So, the scene is familiar to those who watch movies of our own Great Depression. Hungry men wander the streets, wondering how they're going to feed their families. Many deliberately sought arrest so that they could get some food in prison. That was the only option after days of wandering around with nothing. The Reichstag, and tragically again, is immobilized by disagreement over how to handle this economic disaster. With the legislature unable to agree on a coherent plan for dealing with this economic chaos, President Hindenburg counters with the imposition of Article 48, the emergency clause, issuing a decree, the dissolution of the Reichstag. From that point on, Germany is without effective parliamentary government. Parliament would reconvene, but Germany was without effective parliamentary government. Desperately seeking some way out of this economic pit, the German people would listen with growing fascination to the Nazi propaganda machine. Contributions would come from the great industrialists of Germany into the coffers of the Nazi treasury. In the elections of 1932, the Nazis would acquire 230 seats in the Reichstag. This is a landslide in a country that would use proportional representation. They still were without an absolute majority in the legislature, but there was no Nazis would depose Hindenburg with a coup d'etat. The aged von Hindenburg appoints Hitler chancellor on January 30th of 1933. With that act, the Weimar Republic effectively committed suicide. All vestiges of German democracy were now dead, and exactly 1 year later, the Reich was reorganized into a totalitarian dictatorship. The Weimar Republic was born without anything resembling adequate planning, adequate preparation. It was almost an afterthought. The architects of Weimar were in a desperate hurry to produce a government that they thought would be well regarded by the Allies and that would assure them an easier peace after World War I. There was little support from the masses in lieu of the recall of the monarchy of the Hohenzollern dynasty. The vast majority of Germans was much less interested in political matters than they were with their own daily problems, which were of great magnitude indeed. From the days of its origin, the Weimar Republic was unwanted, and its death knells were unlamented. Constructed on a weak frame, the Weimar Republic was unsupported throughout its years by public opinion, and lacking desperately needed help from the outside, it was simply unable to weather the storms of opposition from the left and from the right. It was betrayed by friends and by foes alike. It was simply not strong enough to withstand the political chaos, the economic trials, the social insecurity, and the psychological distress that all marked this most turbulent time. What had started out as a bold experiment in democracy degenerated into the nightmare of Nazism. Thank you. Any questions? You all have your interwar hat?
Listening to you talk, I'm thinking this is happening all over again in Russia. This is happening all over again in Russia. And I won't happen, but that's probably, can it happen? And then also, what can be done to educate people in countries without democracy so that a sort of a bed for democracy is made?
Well, we used to like to say that this is all ducky and rosy when you have 30, 40 years to socialize people into the values of democracy. And, I'd spend a lot of my time in my courses saying that studying the process by which democracy was established in Great Britain and America and Sweden, where have you. Nobody's willing to wait that long. They're immediately the demands of an entire population completely unschooled in democratic values and democratic practices, all crying for a piece of the pie. You add to this disastrous economic circumstances again, and sure, someone like a Zhirinovsky's ugly head rises above the political waters. And yes, we can afford, perhaps unwittingly, to look at him as something of a political clown. Certainly not how they're looking at him in Europe, and he's certainly not looked that way in Russia. And what he says to us appears to be crazy. It's so extremist. I mean, he wants Alaska. He wants to take back the Kuril Islands. This, that, and the other. With him. This man is insane. He has a very strong showing in the Russian legislature. I don't like, in the Duma, I don't like to make historical analogies, but you can't help but look at Weimar and look at Russia. Be chilled. Be very beset with trepidation about what's going on over there. Ironically, and this is a long shot, we may be grateful for the fact that Yeltsin's an autocrat over the long term. We may be grateful for the fact that somebody's in power who's a committed Democrat but has no idea what democracy is all about. So he wants to run the show. He wants to try and get Russia back on its feet. He wants to conduct negotiations single-handedly. He wants to hold off the Zhirinovskys. He wants to hold off the liberals too. He wants to do it himself. Well, that may be what's necessary, not just in Russia, but particularly in Russia. But you're dealing with the same kind of political environment. You're dealing with a nation that has no legitimate experience, no experience with democracy to speak of. And all of a sudden we're holding them to that we would subject ourselves to for effective democratic government and civil liberties and a performing economy. And we haven't seen the beginning of the worst for Russia yet. Wait until Yeltsin really dismantles state control of the economy. Then what's going to happen to all of those supported industries that the Russian government is paying for now? Wait until inflation has been a problem in Russia for years. Wait until unemployment catches up with it. That's when you're really going to see the people scream. And that's when someone like a Zhirinovsky could become a very serious problem, and that's when the rug could be pulled out from under Yeltsin. And that's just Russia. Sir.
You spoke about the communist threat to Germany. Could you give us a background on the extent of fascism in Europe during this period?
On the
extent of fascism.
Fascism. Right. That largely owing to economic collapse attracted people on the basis of an appeal to old glories, to lost splendor, to a restoration of national pride, and who had a strong military presence, a semblance of order, an appeal to tradition, law and order, old values. Again, just the attractiveness of order, the attractiveness of a semblance of an orderly life is what in many respects motivates typically young men out of work, no immediate prospects, no hope for an economic upturn, to look for a political messiah. And that was occurring all over Europe during this period, and in Eastern Europe as well. I mean, after World War I, Eastern Europe's getting on its feet as separate nations. They're establishing democracies one by one. With the exception of Czechoslovakia, those democracies collapse, those democratic governments collapse, and the pendulum swings once again to the authoritarian right. And that's, in some respects, what, ironically now, the old order, the reactionaries, are the communists. That's tradition. Those are the old values. That was order. Very much the same, but from the opposite end of the political spectrum.
Since the left wasn't united, that wasn't a successful way to keep the right from right. What about anti-socialist sentiment throughout the world? Like, say, had the left been gaining power in Germany, maybe the Allies would have done something soon. Because the industrialists were on the side of the right, or in the right were together, and that was better for us.
I think that's a good point. I think that's probably quite an accurate point. We've always regarded the left as more of a serious threat than we have the right. Huh? And the problem was at the time that we were recovering from World War I, too. We didn't want to launch a major campaign anywhere. Well, let's see what the Germans can do for themselves, and then we'll consider a check or two. And that's an interesting point.
Could you say more about Hitler's finances? Because it seems like in the early 1930s that even the industrialists wouldn't have that much money to sponsor them.
Well, they still did. And we're talking about
the mega cartels of their day, the Krupps, the Thyssens, Bayer, all of these characters who still had plenty hoarded away, and certainly more than anyone else. And any party that they were going to lend their support to was at an inestimable advantage over any other. And indeed, they looked at Hitler as the man who would lead them out of economic disorder. And in a sense, they were right, because they knew that he was calling for the creation of a war machine. Well, what better news for industrialists? This is Valhalla. Phil.
Proportional representation in your presentation comes out certainly as one of the villains of the Weimar Republic peace. And yet proportional representation is still the formative principle of the Bundestag in today's Germany, as it is in various other countries. What's the difference between then and now? How is it that it can work now with then?
Oh, well, now we discussed that catch before. I know what you're getting at. In Germany now we have, of course, that 5% hurdle, which was put into place after World War II, insisted upon by the Allies, and it works. And it's undemocratic, and it doesn't let any party that gets less than 5% of the national vote into the legislature. And it doesn't provide a political voice to anyone who voted for those minor parties, and they're deprived of representation, and it's made democracies much safer. And if you look at Eastern Europe, if you look at Hungary, if you look at the Czech Republic, even if you look at the Romanians, you'll see that they have adopted the same sorts of provisions. In Hungary's case, I believe it's 4%. It might be 6% somewhere else. But all of these countries have adopted this measure as an effective means of doing precisely the sort of thing that would have made a much more operable political structure. Keep the extremists out. Also, consolidate the number of parties who have a chance at getting into the legislature. When the Germans had their first election in 1949, there's something like 9 parties that ended up in the Bundestag. Within 8 years, it was down to 4, and it remained there until 1982, when the Greens appeared on the scene. Well, again, there's not a lot of diversity. We talk about the German political party system as a cartel of elites, limited voices, limited ideological diversity, limited representation, stable. A stable democratic party system. That's the trade-off. Italy has a proportional representation system. Look what happens. I mean, they're now in the throes of trying to construct a new republic. Too many parties spoil the political broth.
Getting away from the extremes and coming closer to home is a really good working democracy. If we can have someone like a Colonel North running here, the public is not voting to the extent they could, should be informed. Are we in any danger ourselves of looking at down the road?
At what? Sort of the chaos of
I mean, apathetic public.
I think always, always. Democracy, or what passes for democracy in the modern era, depends on participation, education, and interest. And as you very rightly point out, where's the interest? Where's the commitment? Where's the understanding of what it means to be? Where's the responsibility? And it's not just us. It's a political ennui that swept Europe. I mean, again, look at the Hungarians. They just established themselves as a democracy in something like their second election. 40% of the electorate turns out because sickened by what the parties are doing in the legislature. That's in 2 years.
Well, how do we get people to turn around and instead of staying away because they're so sickened to get up on their hind legs and go to vote to make a difference?
Well, maybe the answer isn't voting. Maybe the answer comes in something like supporting an interest group, supporting a local movement, getting a stop sign put up on a street corner and going from there. Little things, moving up.
Could you comment a little bit about the philosophy, if there is one, or ideology, and the nature of the Republicans that are prominent in Germany today?
Even the German press now says that the Republikaner are very reluctant to even attribute to themselves anything resembling a coherent philosophy, and that's probably a good thing because they don't have one. But they also they have been masking their rhetoric for the past 4 years or so because, as you know, the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany was investigating them because another good safeguard in this Germany's democracy is the fact that their version of the Supreme Court has the power to declare political parties unconstitutional, and they must thereby be dissolved if they the constitutional order. In other words, if they are anti-system parties. Well, they've done that twice. They did it with the Communist Party, and they did it with the neo-Nazis. This was back in the 50s and 60s. They threatened also to dissolve the Republikaner. So the Republikaner really had to tone down its political message. But just a couple of weeks ago, in This Week in Germany, there was a compelling article about how similar the rest of the Republikaner is to the Nazi Party. I have no doubt that the sentiments are the same. But their appeal, and that's really their political appeal, their platform, if you will, is very much traditional honor, law and order, family values, throw these damned foreigners out, Germany for the Germans, the retrieval of the Platz in der Zone, this sort of thing. Philosophy? No. No. Yes, sir. Yes.
You are terrific.
Well, thank you.
I'm glad that you're
That was the best question. All right. On that good note, we'll leave you for the